right. Sorry it's a little cold in here today. We didn't quite get that boiler going yet, so I forgot to. But we all got our coats on, and hopefully we're doing all right. All right, let's warm things up a bit with the Bible. Okay. All right, so I know we're all going to remember how Adam and Eve decided that they would not trust God, right? How they were tricked by the tempter that came to them in the garden, and they sinned. Their choice separated them from God. They were forced to leave the garden, which was the place of God's rest. Now, even though God punished them for their sin, He did not leave them all alone in the wilderness. He allowed them to seek after Him and to have a relationship with Him, even though they now lived apart from Him. And that is where we pick up the story today. You see, Adam had two sons who lived during this time. A son named Abel and a son named Cain. Right, good. Now these two brothers, they worked in the fields. They toiled hard in a land of thorn and thistle in order to provide for themselves. And both Cain and Abel decided that they should seek out the Lord who had created them. Now, we don't learn everything there is to know about all of this, but we can assume that the reason they did this was because their father and mother had told them all about what had happened in the garden. Now, Abel was a good shepherd. He decided that he would worship God by giving God his very best. He came before the Lord with the finest young lamb from all of his herd. And there he made a sacrifice to God to worship Him. God was well pleased with Abel, for he worshiped the Lord with all of his heart. And this is all right there for you to read here in the book of Genesis, chapter 4. Now here's actually what the New Testament says about Abel. It's a good summary. Hebrews 11:4 says this: By faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. So that's Abel. Abel was a good boy. Now let's talk about that other brother. Let's talk about Cain, right? Now, Cain also thought that he should seek after the Lord. Cain was a farmer, so he did not have a fine lamb like his brother had to offer up to the Lord. So let's admit he was at a bit of a disadvantage, but he did have some crops. He also had a brother who had some lambs. Abel seemed like a good guy. Probably he could have traded with Abel. Probably Cain could have figured something out. But you know what, for Cain, maybe that was a little too much effort. So instead of bringing the best in faith to offer to the Lord, Cain brought some of the crops he had on hand, although he knew that would not likely be valued by God. Now, when Cain realized that God had liked Abel's offering better than his own, Cain grew resentful in his heart. He began to harbor a great anger against his brother Abel. Now, God saw the anger that grew up in Cain's heart, and he knew that this anger would lead only to trouble. So he went to Cain and he spoke with him. He said, Cain, this anger that you have is a sin. Look, if you do what is right, then I will accept it. But if you let this anger inside of you continue to grow, it's going to destroy you. Well, that's all right there in Genesis chapter 4 for us to read about. But you want to see what God really said. I know you do. So here it is. Genesis 4, 6 through 7. These are the Lord's words to Cain. Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, look, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So that's word for word what God said. Well, I'm quite sure it would be if God spoke English to Cain, which is unlikely. But, all right, let's stop here at this point in the story and talk a little about anger, because that was Cain's problem. Well, probably one of them at any rate, but it was certainly the sin that God said was crouching at his door. Like a lion, right? What crouches? A lion, right? So this lion of sin is crouching at his door. So let's talk about that. We all know what it's like to get angry. And anger can be a very powerful emotion, even before it becomes a sin. It comes on us very quickly, and it can be very hard to control. Anger it's not good. At least not this kind of anger. Not the anger that Cain had. Anger is first an emotion before it's a sin. It's not always a sin. And honestly, some things are good to be angry about. There is actually an anger which comes from how much we love someone. If we see someone we love hurting themselves, that probably should get us angry in a certain way. That's one type of anger. That's a good anger. But, that type of anger is usually easy to see for what it is. That type of anger is about wanting good things for others. And usually that is very obvious. But look, this other type of anger, and we all know what I'm talking about, this other type of anger, it's a petty anger. It all comes back to me not having my way in the world, right? To me thinking God is out to get me. It's a selfish anger. This is what God warns Cain about. And basically he says, look, do you want to think about this the right way? Because you still can. If you offer me a good offering, I'm going to accept it. I will accept you, Cain, if your heart is right before me. But now, here's the thing about anger. If you want to be sure to have a wrong heart towards God, then go ahead and feed that anger. Be an angry person. And that anger, like a crouching lion, is going to jump on you from the inside, and it's going to tear your heart to shreds. It is going to ruin you towards God. It is going to ruin you towards your brother, your sister, your mom, your dad, and everyone else. This was what God was warning Cain about. You see, Cain still had a chance to be a master over his own emotions and the growing evil that was inside of him. He could still think about things the right way, to step into the light of God's truth and to let go of his anger. But I think we know this story, right? Does Cain say, okay, God, you're right? No, he does not. Cain did not heed God's warning. He let his jealousy and his hatred for his brother grow until one day he went to his brother and he said, Abel, come with me to the fields, and I have something very wonderful to show you. Maybe that's what Cain said. Sure, why not? Abel trusted his brother, right? Why wouldn't he? He didn't know about Cain's secret anger. Well, once they were in Cain's field, Abel said, well, what is it you want to show me, brother? And Cain replied, wait right here and I'm going to show you. And Cain left and found a real big rock. And then he returned and he said, here's this rock, brother. Cain lifted up the rock, and instead of showing his brother, he struck him hard with many blows until Abel was dead. I added a little flavor to that part of the story, I will admit. Really, here's all the Bible says about the murder. Genesis 4:8. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So what happened next? Well, Abel's blood soaked the fields where he had been slain. The evidence of Cain's hateful anger and murder were there for all to see. But nevertheless, Cain tried to hide the murder that he had done. A lot of hiding is going on now in God's world, if you think about it. But this is a very good lesson for us. We can hide from others. We can hide from ourselves. But no one hides from God. Not then, not now, not ever. So God came to Cain's fields and asked Cain, Cain, where's your brother? Of course, we all know about God and how he asks questions, right? We talked about that last week, so we're not going to go into it again today. But here is a leading question, if ever there was one. And this is what Cain answers back to God. This is a classic answer. So classic. Why do you ask me? More like, why do you ask me, right? Am I my brother's keeper? To God, that's what he says. That's sick. Am I my brother's keeper? He's asking God, hey, since when was it my job to take care of Abel? Right? Well, Cain, now that you mention it, you know what? It's always been your job to take care of Abel. We should all be taking care of each other. That's why God made us. Well, let's put it this way. Definitely, it wasn't your job to kill your brother. Okay? It's twisted. It's sick. And yet, that is the way that it is now. Everyone doing their dirty business, and yet acting so aloof, so smug, so self-satisfied, so full of themselves, so proud of the things that we've become. But it's all just smoke and mirrors, isn't it? It's all just a lot of fig leaves and snarky rhetorical questions and hiding in the bushes. But like we said, there is no hiding from God. He knows what we are, and He knows what we've done. And the Lord said, "What have you done?" He doesn't wait for an answer on this one. He says, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." And that's what God says to him. Think about what He says. He says, you already had to work the ground with pain and toil. But now, not even that's going to work for you. So yes, the curse of Adam was already in effect, but now it just got even worse. And let's keep that in mind. You know, we all live in the world of Adam and Eve's curse. But we still have it within us to make things better or to make things a heck of a lot worse. That's our choice to make in this world. Some things we don't get to choose. We don't get to choose to have a perfect world with no problems and no curse. But we can choose whether we will make things better for ourselves and other people around us or worse. We can create a place of love around us in the midst of this broken world. Or we can choose sin. And we can inflict this broken world and ourselves in it with even worse pain and suffering than it already has. I mean, think about it. Cain chose to ignore God, and he let the lion inside of him win. And so the curse came true, even more true than it had been before. Because Eve's curse was that in pain she would bring children into the world. And that was before brother had slain brother. And you tell me which pain was worse for Eve and for everyone else. The pain when Abel came into the world, or the pain she felt when he left it. And now the story of God's world takes a very dark turn. And the strife between brothers begins to multiply, and things begin to become worse and worse because of sin. Now, it wasn't all darkness. You know, we will learn about Eve's hope being restored in the birth of Seth and the godly line that culminates in Noah. And we will talk about that next week. But before we finish our lesson this week, I'd like for us to see just how much hatred began to grow in God's world. And that is exemplified in Cain's son, Lamech. Who's ever heard of Lamech? Only a couple of people. Well, there are actually two Lamechs in the Genesis. There's the good Lamech, and then there's the bad Lamech. Good Lamech was actually Noah's father, and we're going to actually learn about him, but that'll be later next week. But today, it's bad Lamech, son of Cain. And really, what Lamech says is an even better expression of human depravity than what Cain had answered back to God a few verses ago when he said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Although fewer people have heard about Lamech. So here it is in Genesis chapter 4. It's right there for you, verses 23 and 24. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. What a delightful example of husband-to-wife communication. Surprisingly, Gary Chapman has not listed chest-beating manifestos of vengeance among his best-selling 5 love languages. Now, believe it or not, there is a theological purpose in preserving this little declaration of hatred for thousands and thousands of years. This little caveman rant, it's the perfect example of the depraved human heart. So Cain kills his brother. He gets punished by God and is forced to become a wanderer among men. But in compassion, God had given Cain a mark. And he says that anyone who would seek to avenge the death of Abel by killing Cain would thus incur the revenge of God sevenfold. Now you can read about that yourselves. That's right there in Genesis chapter 4. So the point of all of this is that God was looking to stop the cycle of bloodshed at one murder. That was the standard he was setting. And God sets, the status quo very early. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. And yet here is Lamech. My wives, you have heard that it was God's place to bring revenge. Well, listen to me. I, Lamech, I am a vengeful God, and I will bring revenge 70 times 7 on anyone who crosses me. So this is the perfect example of the hatred and evil of humankind as it spirals further and further away from God after the fall. And it is the perfect demonstration of what every person becomes when they lose themselves to anger. They dethrone God as God, and they put themselves in God's place. This inescapable bent towards petty, angry, and vindictive justice. This is what lurks even now in the dark corners of our nature, and it is the basis for many of the laws in the Old Testament, in fact. Because what's the alternative? In a world of Lamechs, there would be nothing but violence and revenge. A world where every Lamech, son of Cain, lives and breathes revenge and retribution. And where does something like that even end? This is precisely what is inside every human heart. You see, here's the thing we've got to realize about Cain and about Lamech. Cain and Lamech are not monsters. Cain and Lamech, they are what any one of us could be if we let anger and hatred and resentment fester in our hearts. And what is the answer to all of this? What's the solution from going to Cain to Lamech to a world full of anger, strife, and violence? What's the solution? Is it justice? Is that the solution? We hear so much about justice from the world, as if they would even recognize it if they saw it on the side of the road. I wonder, if every single person in the world got exactly what they deserved, what would that be like? Not even 70 times 7, which is closer to what we would do. But just straight up, everyone across the board got exactly what was coming to them. And I don't mean what they think they deserve. I mean what God really knows that every one of us deserves. What if we actually got that? I think many of the people that we see today crying for justice would not be crying so loudly if they really knew what God's total and complete justice really meant. Now, don't get me wrong. Justice is good. But justice without mercy is terrible. Thank God that his plan, see, someone does have a solution. It's God. And his plan to all of this mess that we've made of the world has never been justice and justice alone. But first, God's plan, well, listen, one day his justice is going to be done. But first, God's plan was to make a way for mercy. Because mercy is the only thing that can truly save us. It can save us from eternal hell. And it can also save us from the hell on earth that we see all around us. A hell that we make worse when we choose anger instead of love. When we choose resentment and bitterness instead of forgiveness and a brighter future for everyone. This world will tell us that forgiveness can only go so far. But that's not what Jesus said. When Jesus taught about forgiveness, he taught radical forgiveness. The kind of forgiveness that could completely transform a human heart, and in the process, the entire course of a person's life. It changed Peter's life. Peter was always a little slow on the uptake, and I'm not talking, and this is who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Jesus' number one disciple, Peter. We all know about him, right? He had a big heart, big heart, made a lot of mistakes, put his foot in his mouth constantly, but man, did Peter love Jesus. Peter was great. Well, the thing about Peter is he also thought he was pretty great. And so one day, as Jesus was talking about forgiveness, and at this point Peter hadn't been transformed by the power of Jesus' forgiveness yet, so he really didn't know anything about that he was talking about, but he thought he knew what he was talking about. So he said to Jesus, "Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother?" 7 times, right? Yeah, see, 7 times, that's good. That's 7 times is a good and holy number. 7 times is very generous. Here's what Jesus said. I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. That should sound familiar, Jesus' answer right there. You see, we just read the guy Jesus was quoting. That's right. Jesus quotes bad Lamech. And he quotes bad Lamech, right? To show us the type of radical forgiveness that he was really talking about. He quotes it to show, yeah, you guys all remember Lamech, right? That's not the way to go. That's radical retribution. That's the deep, dark, spiraling road that leads away from God. That's not what God created us for. Radical retribution is no solution to the mess that we've made. But let me tell you what is the solution. Radical forgiveness. Maybe we might think we know about forgiveness just like Peter did, but here's the thing. You can't really know about radical forgiveness unless you've experienced it for yourself. You see, once we come to find God's forgiveness for everything that we've done, that is when God will transform our hearts. That lion that is crouching in our hearts to devour us, it doesn't have to. Is it anger? Is it lust? Is it vain conceit? It could be any number of 100 things. It doesn't matter. We can learn to forgive because we can come to God and be forgiven. No matter what sin or sins are in our hearts, we do not have to be devoured by sin like Cain and Lamech were, because God's forgiveness, it's good for the big sins, and it's good for the things we think are little sins, and all the sins in between. Sin only makes the darkness even darker. But the love of God can lead us through that darkness, through the darkness of sin, through the darkness of hate, and it can show us what it means to make things better around us in the world today. And this is what makes things better. When each and every one of us makes our own choice to forgive the people around us. But that starts with us seeking forgiveness from God. Nobody forgives other people if they don't think they also need forgiveness. That's the forgiveness Jesus is talking about. It starts with each person. It starts in every one of us. It starts in our small circles, in our homes, in our families, in our churches. It starts with choosing a life of forgiveness instead of a life of anger. And by the power of Jesus' blood, we can. Let us pray.